Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Mike Bankole. Great to have you back. How you been?
Yeah, been good. Busy summer, but back in action, ready to rock and roll.
We've got lots to talk about this evening. Trump has arrived in the UK for a historic second state visit. There'll be lots of superlatives in this story. The biggest set of royal guards. I'm going to need the auto cue for this one because you can tell I don't know any of this royal language. Israel has opened a route for Palestinians fleeing the military's new ground offensive in Gaza City. Now, when we say has opened a route, they are, participating in ethnic cleansing. And messages from Charlie Kirk's alleged killer have been released. Really interesting story there. First, I have a question for you. Do you get the cortado? And I don't mean the coffee. I'm talking about our most popular newsletter sent out each and every Friday morning. Ash is usually at the helm, but this Friday, our very own Harriet Williamson will be giving you her freshest take of the week. So don't miss out. Get it straight into your inbox by signing up at novara.media/the cortado. Do it right now. Open the tab. Go on. There we go. Don't go away from this screen, though. US President Donald Trump has arrived in the UK for his second state visit, making him the first elected politician in modern history to be invited twice by the monarch. Trump and his wife Melania landed in the UK on Air Force One last night. Their visit is controversial, not least of all because they arrived on the same day that the UN declared that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, and one that, of course, is funded and supported to the hilt by the Trump administration. Trump's reward for supporting a genocide is a very grand reception by our royal family at Windsor Castle. This morning, the Trumps arrived by helicopter where they met the King and Queen. That a arrival by air is part of a larger travel plan for the Trumps. That means they won't appear in public. And you can see that with Will and Kate there. The visit will be taking place entirely behind closed doors to spare them from protesters. Later, Trump was invited to inspect the largest ever guard of honor at a state visit, involving 1,300 members of the British military and 120 horses. In the mid-afternoon, Trump was also treated to a fly-past in his honor, involving RAF and US Air Force planes, as well as the Red Arrows. Apparently, that's the first time that's ever happened as well. So very exciting for Donald Trump. As we went on air, the Trumps were likely dressing for their lavish state banquet, also taking place in Windsor Castle this evening and presided over by the King. There have also been protests today, though, in London. A protest organised by the Stop Trump Coalition has taken place. Thousands of people turned out, including hundreds of school and university students who walked out of their classrooms to participate, involving more than 50 different groups. The Met deployed 1,600 officers to police the demonstration. There were also protests in Windsor, with hundreds of people holding signs reading "Dump Trump," while chanting "Donald, Donald, you can't hide, we charge you with genocide." Reuters spoke to some of those demonstrators outside Windsor Castle.
His actions and his inactions are causing instability in the world, overturning the world order that we've got used to. He could have stopped the war in Ukraine. He could stop the war in Gaza if he wanted to. I don't understand why he doesn't want to. He's the most dangerous man in the world.
He's in Putin's pocket. He's making the war in Palestine worse. He's supporting Netanyahu, Christo-fascism in America. He's surrounded by ignorant sycophants who are just all about their money as well. And the Epstein scandal, everything at the moment is a distraction.
Now, those demonstrations seem to have taken place uneventfully, but other protesters have found themselves in trouble with the law. So on Tuesday night, the mugshots of Donald Trump, as well as those of his friend, the paedophile sex trafficking billionaire Jeffrey Epstein, were projected onto the walls of a tower at Windsor Castle. The display also contained video footage of their interactions, as well as quotes of the flattering things Trump wrote to Epstein in the infamous birthday book. 4 people were later arrested on suspicion of malicious communications connected to the display, and as of this morning, remain in custody. Led by Donkeys organised the stunt, with a spokesperson saying this about the arrests. "My colleagues were arrested for malicious communications, which seems ridiculous because we've done 25 or 30 projections before. No one's ever been arrested. I think they've been arrested for embarrassing Donald Trump." And that wasn't the only police intervention in a peaceful political protest. over the last couple of days. So this van drove around Windsor today, displaying an image of Trump and Epstein together. It was quickly stopped by police and seized, with reports that 2 journalists covering it were also briefly detained. Thames Valley Police said it was stopped because it was, quote, at risk of breaching the Road Traffic Regulations Act, which I don't particularly believe. Now, what this reminds me of, Mike, is when there was the King's coronation and there were sort of anti-monarchy protesters. Clearly, the police were just terrified that there would be any kind of sort of interruption of the proceedings. And so they just arrest people on very spurious grounds and say, well, if they take us to court and we end up having to pay them out some money, so be it, because our priority is that nothing can stand in the way of this being a perfectly scripted event, which is what Keir Starmer wants with Donald Trump over the next couple of days.
It's the exact same thing. I think a lot of this is about the broader crackdown against protests, like any dissent. So I see it as a post-2020 legacy with Black Lives Matter, which obviously captivated imaginations in 2020. We saw the widest and largest anti-racist protest in British history. And following that, we saw the Conservative Party kind of essentially launch quite problematic policies to try and kind of quell that dissent, to kind of quell that protest. Now, what's happened in the years following that is obviously the Conservative Party have been voted out of government, but the Labour Party have actually in many ways just continued that legacy of quite tight policing of these events and trying to really crack down on dissent in some ways. So I think it's worrying this is happening under a Labour government, but again, it's Keir Starmer's Labour government, so it's not really a surprise this is happening under his stewardship. But I think this is why I'm so heartened by the Trump protests we've seen today in London and in Windsor, is because it is becoming increasingly difficult to kind of voice dissent in Britain, because there are kind of laws being passed, and laws that have been passed to try and quell this. So yeah, I think you're right in that this is very reminiscent of kind of what happened with the King's coronation a few years ago. But I think this is part of a broader kind of attempt by the British state to quell dissent.
And so, as I was saying earlier, this is unprecedented. This is the first person or the first Democratic leader to be offered 2 state visits. I think before there were a couple of monarchs who did. I can't remember precisely who. You can tell I really do my research when it's a kind of royal state visit story, but there we are. My political analysis of this is that Keir Starmer has really effed up, actually, for a couple of reasons. I think he made it, I mean, similar to the Epstein story, where they think that having principles is a sign of political immaturity. They decided that what a mature leader would do is completely brown nose this president, even though his politics is supposedly completely different to yours. And not just, I don't think they should put 2 fingers up at Donald Trump, but the idea that he gets better treatment than any other president in history just seems completely bizarre from a centre-left government. I think that makes Keir Starmer look weak. Also, I think there's a big problem because, what Keir Starmer should really be doing at the moment is desperately trying to delegitimize the kind of protests we saw in London on Saturday, where you had lots of very far-right people speaking from a stage in very ethno-nationalist terms. Now, if in that same week he is, we won't see a press conference between Starmer and Trump today. That's going to be tomorrow. But presumably there are going to be a lot of very kind words from Keir Starmer to Donald Trump. If that's the image being projected to the country, then what he is doing is normalizing the kind of politics we saw on Saturday, not delegitimizing it. So it seems stupid on 2 levels. I think we can bring up some polling about what the public think potentially. So you can see here, all Britons, only 30% think it was the right thing to do to give Donald Trump this 2nd state visit. 45% think it was the wrong thing to do. And then every party thinks it was the wrong thing to do other than Reform voters. So those 64% of Reform voters who think it was the right thing to do, I can be pretty sure they were never going to vote Labour, and they will not vote Labour. So to me, this just seems like another situation where Keir Starmer has rewarded and given a gift to his opposition, which is now Nigel Farage, without getting very much in return. So he hasn't got much in return politically, but what about economically? That's what we'll move on to now. Trump is being treated to a lot of pomp and circumstance while also being protected from the country's opinions of him. Now, all of that is expensive, with the 2-day visit thought to be costing the UK taxpayer in excess of £5 million. I'm actually surprised. I thought it would probably be more than that. But British Prime Minister Keir Starmer already appears to have got something in return. The UK and US have announced a new tech prosperity deal to coincide with the visit, which will see the two countries cooperate in areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and nuclear power. According to the government, the deal has already resulted in £31 billion of investments and partnerships being agreed, which will be injected into the UK at some point in the near future. And a large chunk of that promised investment is coming from Microsoft. So the company has announced a £22 billion spending package. That's the largest it's ever made outside of the United States. But are there strings attached? And is the UK giving up its digital sovereignty by rolling out the red carpet, not just to the president, but to AI bosses too? Well, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella says that's not the case.
To me, it's not about giving up sovereignty. It's about getting more leverage to exercise your sovereignty. We are making this capital investment in the UK soil, right? So these are AI factories, cloud factories that are very much part of the infrastructure of the United Kingdom. And so you have now trusted American technology that UK can use and companies across the UK can use to create more technology for the United Kingdom and for the United States and the world.
Microsoft's investment will be used to build AI infrastructure like data centers, as well as the UK's largest supercomputer. And the Northeast has been singled out for particular investment as a so-called AI growth zone. And the region will receive special support in planning and energy provision. Of course, these things eat up a lot of energy. Other big tech investors include Google, who will open a new data center in Hertfordshire, as well as US chip manufacturer NVIDIA. Their boss said this to the BBC today.
This is the week that I declare that UK will be an AI superpower, and that was the mandate from Prime Minister Sommer. He wants the UK to be an AI superpower. He recognizes that the ingredients are all right here.
Jensen Huang is in the UK with Donald Trump, as are tech bosses Sam Altman of OpenAI and Satya Nadella of Microsoft, who you saw earlier. Apple's Tim Cook is set to join the president and king at the state banquet this evening. So does this make all the brown-nosing of Donald Trump worth it? I'm joined by Bhargav Srinivasa Desikan, AI and tech lead at the Autonomy Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin on what Jensen Huang said. He said, we can be an AI superpower. I suppose my first question for you is, should we want to be?
Okay. Should we want to be? Thanks for having me, Michael. Yeah, it's a tough one because, well, I guess it being framed as a geopolitical question kind of allows to get the pesky activists out of the way as well, right? But should we want to be? I suppose in one way, yes, in the sense that in general, maybe we can agree that investment is good. Ideally, public investment, of course. And we do want to somehow, given that it's going to start becoming a national security issue, and, well, for example, China is racing ahead, the US is racing ahead. But even if we stop thinking about it in the context of, maybe a war or a situation like that, it would be good to, I don't know, I would say keep up with a certain aspect of AI technologies. I wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. My cards on the table. My background is in computer science. Since then, my political allegiances have made me think about how can we make this work for us and work for workers? Is that possible at all? Yeah, sorry. Does that kind of answer your question? Maybe.
Well, I mean, it opens up a few avenues for exploration. I suppose you're talking there about national security. So these will still be sort of owned and run by American companies, Microsoft, Google. I suppose NVIDIA won't be running them because they'll just be supplying the chips. But so if the companies are American-based, but it's situated in the UK, is that still beneficial to the UK in some respect? I suppose that means that, it will create some employment in Britain, but will it give us any control over the technology?
No. And I think so it's funny because, if we are going to get, £31 billion of investment, I can think of many other things that are not AI that money would rather go into. But if it was going to be spent, it would much rather be public so that we own it. We decide what we want to do with it. For example, do we want more TikToks or do we want, more libraries that can kind of, synthesize information, let us pick things up the way we want to digitally, for example? we're not able to choose what we want to do with this kind of investment. And the first layer, I mean, the reason why Amazon, for example, is also so powerful is because with AWS, they own all of the infrastructure. This allows them to kind of be, it's tough to boycott AWS. It's tough to boycott even Google to a certain extent, right? And I think the issue for me with this investment is that we only get the stack above the kind of critical infrastructure. So even in the context of, to your point, in the context of the global security, we're not really making the kind of progress we want. If any, at best, what we're getting is some kind of job creation. But I would say that's it at best, really. Now, if it is all publicly owned, for example, with what China is doing, I think that's a different story. In that case, and then maybe we decide what we want to do with it. For example, there are a few legitimate AI use cases. I can think of, grid optimization, a new kind of material synthesis for renewable energy. Given that we don't have copper access is going to be a problem. So there can be certain like niche scientific use cases for AI where I'm like, okay, maybe it's not all bad. But this kind of investment, I would say it's really going to benefit the US tech companies, and it will, there'll be some GDP growth, if anyone cares about that. I mean, maybe I care about a bit less. But in the context of national security or even just kind of sovereignty or us being in charge of what we want to do with the money we're spending, it's not looking so great.
Does it matter where a data center is? So I suppose that's sort of like, by my understanding, when it comes to AI and data centers, so the data center is needed to train the model, so sort of to give it the weights and stuff. Now, I presume that sort of for training a model, it doesn't really matter where it is. It could be trained anywhere, and then you sort of you get the product. And then it's also used for inference. So every time I go on ChatGPT and ask it a question, which I do multiple times a day, does it what data center is doing the crunching, and does it matter where that is? Do we get some benefit by these data centers being closer to us?
For inference, yes. Not for training. It doesn't matter where the training happens. Once the training happens, what's called a model weight kind of thing. If there are neurons firing, those are kind of loaded up as a sense. But once it's loaded up, you can move it around. So for the training, it doesn't really matter, but for inference, it does matter. But the funny thing is, given the kind of massive climate impact of data centers, ideally we shouldn't be expecting an LLM response in 1 second or 5 seconds or whatever. For example, there is, I think, even within the legitimate scientific use of AI, in those cases, it's possible to do something called a batch training, where you basically make the query, but then you wait for grid levels, or you wait for the load to be less, and then you ask for the query to be done. When you do it like this, it basically means that there's actually less of a climate impact because you're not asking for an immediate response. But that doesn't make for a great consumer product. For you to ask a question and then wait for a couple of days. So that's why they want to build the data centers here in the UK, is because it'll then enable inference-related product development. That's why Oracle is psyched, because they OpenAI and Oracle had a big deal, and I think the CEO of Oracle was saying that all the money to be made is to be made in inference, right? So quick inference, just immediately asking a question, getting an answer. That's where the money is, but it also is where a lot of climate damage is. So from the perspective of getting a quick answer back in the context of inference, yes, it is useful. I mean, but the usefulness is maybe 1 second instead of 3 seconds. I mean, maybe don't quote me on that, but is it worth the impact? I would say probably not.
There's lots of talk about an AI bubble perhaps bursting at some point. I mean, Sam Altman's talked about that himself. And the idea is because so much money is being invested into data centers that potentially at some point you might get overcapacity when people realize, if people realize that it's actually not that easy to make a profit from this particular technology. If there were to be a sort of AI bubble popping, what would that mean for the UK after having attracted all of this investment? Would we end up with a bunch of stranded assets? Or I suppose it's their money, it's Microsoft's money, so it doesn't really matter if they waste it here instead of wasting it somewhere else.
Well, this is what kind of really, really scares me actually about the bubble bursting, is that once I definitely think there is going to be an extent of a bubble bursting. It's tough to say when and how it'll play out. But my main worry is, as a lot of different commercial wrapper companies basically, like, I don't know, so you have something like a AI teacher or something, and then I think a lot of these companies are going to go bust because people are going to realize that it's not going to be so smooth. But there are some situations where AI will get you a return on your profit, a return on your investment, and that is basically extraction from our planet and war. So my main worry is, when all the non-profitable stuff goes kaput, the only things that are worth keeping from the perspective of capitalism really is going to be the war and just war and extraction. So my worry is, when the bubble bursts, all the kind of commercial applications will start to die down just because they won't make enough money. But the stuff that does make money is the most horrible, earth-shattering stuff there is. So that's kind of one particular way in which it's not just me. There's a bunch of people who are talking about this kind of way it plays out, where when kind of commercial use cases die out, the most extractive, harmful use case. And we're already seeing, for example, AI being used in Gaza, AI being, so it's already complicit for a lot of really heinous, horrible stuff. My worry is that, at least right now, we have commercial fluff for it to not be only extraction. 2024, by the way, since 2024 onwards, a lot of tech companies have gone back on their commitment to no AI and war. So basically now AI and war is open game. So that's my kind of, I guess, my first spiel about what might happen when the bubble bursts. And in the other context, and I think this is where it's kind of a stroke of genius from the context of Microsoft, Nvidia, and others, is that all the things that might go bust are the higher level applications on the stack, right? Like the actual data centers, there will always likely be some kind of use case for that. But it just might not be for commercial facing applications. It might be for whatever heinous national security stuff that might be needed. So my worry is, if it's all UK companies who are the kind of wrappers and they go burst, it might be the case that we end up facing the fall of the bubble bursting, but we don't necessarily get the benefits. But who will get the benefits is the kind of infrastructure payout which is going to happen in the first place. The Autonomy Institute, we have some upcoming we have a grant with the AI Security Institute to look at labor market impacts, and we also have upcoming projects on looking at the kind of market dynamics of how certain kind of AI futures might play out. So maybe I could give you a better, kind of more backed up answer in a few months. But as of now, I'm not feeling too great about that bubble bursting, even if it would mean that some of the smugness of AI would go away. I have a feeling that it would backfire in the worst possible way.
Very quickly, but I'm going to ask you a very big question. I don't know where you stand on sort of the AI safety debate, but my understanding was that for a brief period, the UK was seen as taking a leading role. Obviously, we had that AI safety summit. Then Yoshua Bengio, who along with Geoffrey Hinton is one of the people very worried that AI could essentially kill us all, was invited to write a report for the UK government. And sort of, people who I follow in the space were saying that seemed reasonable. They set up this AI Security Institute that you say you're working with. Is the UK still playing that role, if it ever did, or have we now switched to we're just desperate for your money? So screw all the safety stuff. Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, please just come here and give us some crumbs.
I think it's there is still some good kind of technical work. There's a field within AI safety called AI alignment, where there is basically checking how is a model willing to deceive you, stuff like that. Well, ChatGPT just basically will try and deceive you. There is actually reasonably good research being done at the AI Security Institute, most from an academic perspective and a lot of this kind of stuff. But for me, the kind of biggest worry with AI in general is the political economy of it, which might be a boring Marxist answer, but it's, who owns this stuff? If we owned all of it and we decide what we want to do with it, then maybe it would just be less scary. So there's that aspect of safety where the unsafe stuff is that it's all owned by private corporations. from a very technical perspective of, will the models kind of work with humans in a commercial perspective? I think we're doing decent research, actually. And there's, not horrible people, there's good people. Yeah. So there's good people who care about kind of very specific definition, but it is a very, I don't know, I guess a centrist liberal conception of safety and security as, we need to make this technology safe so it doesn't blow up. But it doesn't look at the kind of interconnectedness of things, I think, enough. So yeah, it's here and there. I would say we could be better. We could be a bit more ambitious. We could be a bit more like we decide what we want to do with AI, and it's only going to be for public benefit. But right now, the research is limited to kind of technical safety around these models.
Israel has enforced a new round of mass displacement on Palestinians in Gaza as it begins a ground operation or a ground invasion in Gaza City. A mass exodus of Palestinians is now taking place from Gaza City to the south of the enclave. That's after the Israeli military opened a corridor to allow the 1 million people living in the city to escape Israel's bombing and shooting by heading south. Now, as part of its offensive in Gaza City, the Israeli military has been gradually flattening apartment and office blocks, with dozens leveled in recent days, rendering thousands of people homeless. Israel's military says they've carried out 150 air and artillery strikes in the area in just 2 days, making it amongst the most destructive chapters in Israel's assault so far. Palestinians still remaining in the city were showered in leaflets dropped by Israel today, warning them to leave. The evacuation order says, quote, "Urgent warning to the residents of Gaza City and its neighborhoods. If you find this leaflet, you are in a dangerous combat zone. You must evacuate immediately." That's after Israel launched a new ground operation on Tuesday morning, with 2 army divisions slowly working their way towards the city center. A third is expected to join them in the coming days. Overnight, at least 16 people were killed in the escalating airstrikes. That brings the official death toll of Palestinians killed in Israel's genocidal assault on the enclave to 65,000 people in just 2 years. And yet, exhausted by continual displacement, starved by a continuing aid blockade, and often in despair at the loss of children and loved ones, many Palestinians in Gaza City don't want to leave. The Guardian spoke to medical researcher and mother of 4 children, Sawel, in Gaza City, about whether she would move south. Sawel has been displaced 19 times with her family, and she gave this answer. "I don't own a tent to give us shelter, and they are too expensive to buy. I would not be able to take all of the belongings and supplies I have already bought several times before. Then there is the suffering we would face in searching for water and the lack of empty spaces to stay in. So if I leave, I would simply be going into the unknown." Sawel has been displaced to the south before, an experience she said was influencing her desire to stay put. So she said, "It didn't feel like life at all, living in a tent with insects, rats, sand, the heat of summer, the cold of winter, and the rain. It was an unbearable period. There is not a single day without bombings and deaths in the south, even in the so-called humanitarian zones that the army declared. So would I just be running from death to death? What difference would that make? Human nature seeks stability, where you can lean against a solid wall and feel at home. A piece of fabric is not a house. It does not give you safety, nor the feeling of a home." Now, of course, among the fears of those living in Gaza City is that if they leave and they'll never be able to return, that fear is, of course, not misplaced. This is a satellite image of Gaza City taken on October the 6th, 2023. Nearly 2 years later, this is all that remains of the once bustling city and surroundings. This image was taken on September the 1st this year, before Israel's current offensive began. So it's going to be even more flattened than that. Mike, I find here sort of, I suppose, quite affecting, or very affecting, the combination of that woman's statements quoted in The Guardian and the leaflet by the Israelis. Because essentially, by dropping that leaflet saying, "Urgent, leave now, otherwise you're in a war zone," they're, we know what they're like. They're saying, if you remain in Gaza City in this period of time, you're fair game. So it's up to you. Do you want to leave, or do you want to, find yourself bombed and shot, basically? And then she's describing how horrific a decision she is being forced to make, because she's moved south many times before. They still get bombed there. She got nowhere to live there. I hadn't actually heard that now the reason people don't have tents to live in is because they can't afford tents, because presumably the Israelis have been blocking the humanitarian aid organizations from bringing tents in. But yeah, I suppose your comments on what we've seen over the past couple of days.
Yeah, I guess this in the context of Trump's visit, makes the visit all the more odious because we know that the US are playing such a fundamental role in what is a genocide, and this is forced displacement of people, and we are still seeing the narrative prevail. So obviously, she's been displaced 19 times, to the woman in those quotes, and that's dreadful. Yeah, we're still seeing some quotes in some media suggesting that the people who are choosing to stay are Hamas shields and Hamas human shields, which is one of Israel's obviously big talking points we know. So that narrative is still persisting. But I do think all of this in the context of Trump's visit it just feels odious. It feels odious that we're having this man paraded around Windsor Castle who's not just complicit, playing a very central role in this genocide, playing a central role in the kind of experiences like someone being displaced 19 times and not wanting to leave because they just know that essentially you're going from one battlefield to another. Like that's a horrible experience. And that's an experience, again, being enabled by a man who's walking around the UK, swanning around the UK and being paraded like he's a man of honor, so that makes this a lot difficult. And I think there are other kind of things, and we're not just seeing kind of people like Trump, we're seeing kind of corporations take particularly dodgy stances. I don't know if you saw the news about kind of Ben and Jerry's that emerged today, and I think Jerry's taken a step back from the company at the moment because of what Unilever's position is on kind of Ben & Jerry's social activism, which is what made them very popular as a brand, and they've been kind of limited by Unilever from doing that work. So what's frustrating about this for me is that we're seeing the UN report which came out yesterday, which for me was further intellectual kind of weight in favour of the argument that genocide is happening, which is baffling. We still need more of that weight, but there is still more evidence in our favour here. Obviously, Amnesty International have long called it a genocide. So the intellectual kind of backing that is a genocide is growing and growing and growing, as well as the institutional backing from UN, Amnesty International, and other kind of independent organisations. That is still a thing. Yet we're still seeing corporations like Unilever, for example, adopt these kind of really, we're being neutral. And let's be clear, neutrality in this context is a position. You're choosing to be complicit in my view. You're choosing to step back while a crime is happening and do nothing about it and not take a principled stance. So all of that context makes these stories so difficult for me to hear, because it's like, what more does it take for us to take a more principled position? What more does it take for us as UK to not be kind of welcoming this man over to the country? Again, he's not owed a second state visit because it's very rare that presidents who serve 2 terms have 2 state visits. So this wasn't owed to Trump. And I think your point earlier, Michael, about the idea that the political gain for Starmer isn't that big to kind of inviting this man over. It just makes no sense. Yeah, the story is really, really kind of depressing for me to hear. I think Israel are just kind of getting away with murder because of states like the US and the UK, and corporations aren't standing up to them. And it just feels like such a desperately sad situation and more than anything for me, hearing the quotes that you read out, like, kind of makes it even sadder for me, because you're hearing the human cost of it. Often when we hear about the tens of thousands that have been killed or tens of thousands that have been displaced, yeah, that sounds horrible to us, but we don't know the stories of each and every one of those people. When we hear the stories and hear people talk about being displaced 19 times, that really does strike a chord with me and really does kind of move me in quite an emotional way. So yeah, it's a desperately sad story. And again, the broader context of Trump and Unilever and everything else happening makes this all the more worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to highlight that UN report, which Aaron covered on yesterday's show. Again, and just another institution finding that Israel is committing genocide. Obviously, our government's completely complicit, but Donald Trump is not just complicit; he has sort of been actively promoting this. Everyone remembers his Trump Gaza video. At least the British government pretend they don't want ethnic cleansing and everyone kicked out of Gaza. They say, "Oh, we can't really affect it. We are asking Israel not to do it, but what can we do?" Whereas Trump is actively promoting it, and now he's getting 2 days with the King and Queen, so we can get some Microsoft data centers, it seems.
Case 251-403-576, State of Utah versus Tyler James Robinson. Could you state your name?
Tyler James Robinson.
So, Mr. Robinson, you have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, the court can appoint an attorney to represent you.
So that was Tyler Robinson, the alleged killer of Charlie Kirk, appearing in court in Utah on Tuesday. The vest you saw him wearing there is apparently to prevent self-harm. He faces charges of aggravated murder, and prosecutors are seeking the death penalty. Now, there has obviously been enormous speculation over the motives of Charlie Kirk's murder. And prosecutors on Tuesday gave this account.
Robinson's mother explained that over the last year or so, Robinson had become more political and had started to lean more to the left, becoming more pro-gay and trans rights oriented. She stated that Robinson began to date his roommate, a biological male who was transitioning genders. In one conversation before the shooting, Robinson mentioned that Charlie Kirk would be holding an event at UVU, which Robinson said was a stupid venue for the event. Robinson accused Kirk of spreading hate.
Now, authorities have also released an extraordinary series of what are apparently text messages between Robinson and his roommate and partner exchanged after the killing, which was provided to investigators by the roommate. So in this exchange, you have Robinson, so the alleged killer, saying, "Drop what you were doing, look under my keyboard." And then this is sort of inserted. When the roommate looks under the keyboard, there was a note that allegedly read, "I had the opportunity to take out Charlie Kirk, and I'm going to take it." So that was left under the keyboard before he allegedly shot the guy. Then the roommate says, "What? You're joking, right?" Robinson says, "I am still okay, my love, but I am stuck in Orem for a little while longer yet. Shouldn't be long until I can come home, but I got to grab my rifle still. To be honest, I had hoped to keep this secret till I died of old age. I am sorry to involve you." And then the roommate says, "You weren't the one who did it, right?" And Robinson said, "I am. I'm sorry." So it goes on to say this. "I thought they caught the person," says the roommate. Robinson, "No, they grabbed some crazy old dude, then interrogated someone in similar clothing. I had planned to grab my rifle from my drop point shortly after, but most of that side of town got locked down. It's quiet, almost enough to get out, but there's one vehicle lingering." And then the roommate says, "Why?" Robinson says, "Why did I do it?" The roommate says, "Yeah." Robinson says, "I had enough of his hatred. Some hatred can't be negotiated out." The roommate asked Robinson how long he had been planning the assassination, and he said just over a week. Robinson then describes how he wished he'd collected his gun before he fled the scene. And then he says this. Says Robinson, "Remember how I was engraving bullets? The expletive messages are mostly a big meme. If I see notices bulges ooh on Fox News, I might have a stroke. All right." Robinson ended up in custody after his mother recognized the photo of him released by the FBI, and his father challenged him. His parents are Republicans. Robinson, in the exchange with his roommate, said, "Since Trump got into office, my dad has been pretty diehard MAGA." Lots of people online have sort of commented about how this exchange seems a little bit contrived, in the sense that sort of it touches every single point of the assassination, every little bit of evidence. Everything is tied up in this very short exchange. But what do I know? The question is, do these released conversations and statements by the authorities essentially provide everything we need to know now about the murder of Charlie Kirk? Is the mystery over? I spoke earlier to Will Sommer of The Bulwark, who has been covering the story.
I think there are still a lot of unanswered questions here. On one hand, I also would say I don't really trust the Trump administration in any way. And so I think we have to be very cautious about what we take from them as being the gospel truth. On the other hand, I do think that based on the statements we're getting from police and prosecutors, the idea that his family said he was left-wing, that he he supposedly sent this message saying he shot Charlie Kirk because Charlie Kirk was a hate monger. So I think based on that, I think it's fair to start drawing up an assessment that this was someone from the left or who hated Charlie Kirk because Charlie Kirk was a conservative.
I suppose there's a difference between having some sort of ideas and ideology that conform with the left and then being someone who's like on the organized left. There's not much to suggest this person's politics was particularly coherent, but I suppose we can see a few specific motives coming through. Is that sort of where you're at?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, there's really no evidence that he was, I think number one, I think the Trump administration would love to find evidence that he was in a socialist organization or a really active member of the Democratic Party. And none of that has come out, which makes me think it doesn't exist. On the other hand, I think, as you said, there's really no evidence of him saying, I love Joe Biden or I'm committing this this murder for a particular political figure. Again, really the only statement we have from the suspect, and it's filtered through law enforcement, are these messages where he says, Charlie Kirk's hate can't be negotiated with. He's spreading hate, stuff like that. So that's really sort of the only political valence we've seen in terms of the suspect.
I suppose one other theory that I saw sort of circulating, I suppose from sort of Trumpish supporters, that doesn't seem to be supported in this is that the idea that there was some kind of conspiracy. So I saw lots of people saying, oh, there was this Discord with 20 members, all of them, in their words, either trans or trans adjacent or sort of caring about trans rights. And they'd all plotted this death and all knew in advance. And that seems to be, a fabrication, essentially.
That's right. The reporter Ken Klippenstein has published the transcripts of at least one of these Discords, which looks like a much more kind of typical Discord chat of young men talking about video games, internet culture, and ultimately being completely surprised when one of their friends said, I allegedly that he had murdered Charlie Kirk. And so, as you said, there's really no evidence of a conspiracy theory. The right and the Trump administration have been really into the idea of this kind of nebulous they that was behind the killing, suggesting that other people were involved. But really, at this point, I don't think there's any evidence of that. They say they're investigating. Maybe they'll find something else. But even the trans roommate, who's been kind of a key player in this investigation, law enforcement has said that person was not involved and was not aware of the murder.
And I suppose just to clear something off, you said you don't trust the Trump administration, but you don't really have any doubts that this message exchange is genuine. Am I sort of correct in interpreting you as saying that?
I mean, certainly a lot of Americans are saying it seems fake, that it seems, and on one hand, and perhaps fake from two angles. Number one, some people are saying, well, this was a concoction of the FBI to cover up what really happened. And others are saying, that perhaps the suspect made this sort of pretextually to say, okay, remember to the roommate / lover, you didn't know that I was going to do the murder, and kind of laying the groundwork for maybe a particular narrative of the assassination. But I would say that, besides some of the language is a little stilted, but, I don't know. I don't think there's any real hard evidence or reason to believe that this was fabricated at this point.
I saw someone saying they'd put it into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT had told them that this was way too incriminating to be real, because it does look a bit like it's scripted. I'm not suggesting it was, but when you do read it, it's a bit like, how can you in 20 lines demonstrate the fact that this person did it and the other person didn't know? If you were a playwright or whatever. But I suppose your final comment on that before we move on to other sort of wilder theories potentially.
I would agree with that. I mean, the phrasing is it sort of ties the Tyler Robinson, the suspect, to each piece of evidence, saying, and then I put the gun in the woods, and I sure hope law enforcement doesn't find it. And here's how I got the gun, and here's how I got away, and stuff like that. And I agree. I mean, it's very incriminating, and in a way, it's this guy who managed to get away for nearly 48 hours, and then suddenly decides to put all this in writing that can be used as evidence. It's a little suspicious, I think. But then again, I mean, that's how criminals often get caught. They make a big mistake.
Yeah, and it even has the message sort of, please delete this conversation, which then doesn't get deleted. You've written a piece for The Bulwark on other theories circulating about the killing of Charlie Kirk. So let's sort of go through some of the main ones. So one of them is that Israel could have been involved. And I imagine this would come from sort of some people on the left, but it's coming more sort of vociferously, I suppose, from people to the right, potentially, of Charlie Kirk. And I'm going to show a clip of Candace Owens. So she made claims about a recent meeting in the Hamptons, which many have read as supporting the idea that Israel could have been involved in this death.
Essentially what was staged, an intervention was staged by Bill Ackman, because Charlie's rational thoughts about Israel were a no-no. This is not the route that you should be going on. And I know that Charlie was offered a ton of money in this moment, a ton of money. Maybe would fund it, spend tons of money. And Turning Point, I guess, if it needed to go to a higher level, would have gone to an even higher level than it already was at. And I know for a fact that Charlie denied that funding, that Charlie denied, and what Bibi didn't include there, He declined to go to Israel for, I would describe this as like, re-education camp. We've seen it.
Will, what's going on there? I mean, Candace Owens, I think she's currently getting sued, isn't she, for spreading the fabrication that Macron's wife is trans. I have seen, very legitimate people, though, pointing out that Kirk had become a bit more questioning of Israel in the sort of weeks running up to his death. What's your sort of interpretation of this narrative?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously Israel, whenever I think a big news event happens, Israel or Jews are blamed for it. In this situation, Israel is really sort of the fault line running between that's dividing the young American right. And you have a lot of people like Tucker Carlson, like Candace Owens, who are very critical of Israel. I mean, in her case, I think she's been very openly anti-Semitic in the past. And she was also very close with Charlie Kirk. And so you can see this kind of grappling over what Charlie Kirk's legacy means. You have a very pro-Israel pundit in the United States, Ben Shapiro, who's really sort of cozying up and perhaps being positioned as Charlie Kirk's heir. And she's kind of pulling away from that. And what she's doing is laying the groundwork here. She's not quite saying Israel killed Charlie Kirk, but she's saying, wow, look at this coincidence that Charlie Kirk was becoming more critical of Israel and being pressured by donors to be more supportive of Israel right in the days leading up to his death. And that is true. I mean, there was this, Charlie Kirk was becoming, by the standards of an American conservative pundit, critical of Israel and starting to say, okay, maybe it's time to wrap up this war in Gaza, stuff like that.
Yeah, let's talk about another theory, which I suppose has been more on my feed actually than that one. So on the left, many people are claiming that Tyler Robinson might actually have come from the right. And the argument here is, I suppose, because he's from a Republican family for a start, but then also he seems to have been completely sort of taken by internet meme culture. It was meme culture that was sort of ingrained in some of those bullets which were found. And they've seen this post as significant. So it says, it's from his mum from 2018. Happy Halloween. Handing out candies alone since these weirdos ditched me. Tyler is some guy from a meme. And then what you can see is Tyler sort of crouching down in an Adidas tracksuit. And some people have said this looks like a Pepe the Frog meme, and Pepe the Frog being a very popular character for groypers. And Will, I suppose to begin with, in case some of our audience aren't familiar, can you outline what a groyper is? I know you write about this a lot. And then I know from your blog that you don't think it's convincing that Robinson was a groyper. So yeah, tell me what a groyper is and why you don't think that's what's necessarily going on in this case.
Yeah, sure. So the key thing to understand here is that in the United States, there's this white nationalist podcast figure who's kind of like a mirror image or a more evil version of Charlie Kirk. And his name is Nick Fuentes. And he has an audience he's been very successful and he's very outright racist and anti-Semitic. And his followers, who call themselves groypers, and they're taking the Pepe the Frog meme and they made it kind of a little more twisted, made it like an obese toad they named Groyper. And so they've adopted this for fans of Nick Fuentes, called themselves Groypers. Now, Nick Fuentes has clashed with Charlie Kirk in the past, and at one point he encouraged the Groypers to crash Turning Point USA events and basically push them to be more racist, to criticize Charlie Kirk for not being racist enough in their point of view, being open to non-white immigration. And so after Charlie Kirk was shot, I think a lot of people reasonably thought, I wonder if this guy was a follower of Nick Fuentes, a groyper, who had, kind of followed his leader's criticism of Charlie Kirk and shot him. Well, I think a lot of the evidence suggests that is not the case. I think it was a reasonable thing to suspect before we knew the killer's name or the suspect's name and had this proof or this evidence. But basically, in this case, he's dressed up as a meme, and this gets a little into the weeds. But he is dressed as a meme of a Slavic man, a Russian man in a tracksuit squatting. People saw this picture of Pepe the Frog doing the same meme. But basically, both Tyler Robinson and the Pepe the Frog meme are pulling off from a branch meme of this Slavic man squatting that is not necessarily a Pepe the Frog meme. And so that, I think, created this confusion. And I think, look, for the American left, and I understand why, it would be very, there would be an irony, there would be, it would, sort of take the heat off the left. I mean, we're at a point where the Trump administration wants to use this murder basically to suppress half of the political spectrum. I mean, they're saying we're going to go after the left, we're going to go after all these institutions, these media outlets that are clearly operating under the First Amendment. They want to pursue them based on some, non-existent culpability for this murder. And so I can understand why people would want to see that this guy was coming from the right, but I don't see a lot of evidence for that right now.
And let's talk about the Trump administration's response. Obviously, Trump had a very divisive message from the get-go.
For years, those on the radical left have compared wonderful Americans like Charlie to Nazis and the world's worst mass murderers and criminals. This kind of rhetoric is directly responsible for the terrorism that we're seeing in our country today, and it must stop right now.
J.D. Vance continued on that vein when he sort of was a guest host of the Charlie Kirk show on Monday.
That something has gone very wrong with a lunatic fringe, a minority, but a growing and powerful minority on the far left. There is no unity with people who scream at children over their parents' politics. There is no unity with someone who lies about what Charlie Kirk said in order to excuse his murder. There is no unity with someone who harasses an innocent family the day after the father of that family lost a dear friend. There is no unity with the people who celebrate Charlie Kirk's assassination. And there is no unity with the people who fund these articles, who pay the salaries of these terrorist sympathizers, who argue that Charlie Kirk, a loving husband and father, deserved a shot to the neck.
The most sinister line, though, came from Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy for Donald Trump, Stephen Miller.
The last message that Charlie sent me was, I think it was just the day before we lost him, which is that we need to have an organized strategy to go after the left-wing organizations that are promoting violence in this country. And I will write those words onto my heart and I will carry them out. We are going to channel all of the anger that we have over the organized campaign that led to this assassination to uproot and dismantle these terrorist networks.
So Stephen Miller says the state will put all of their effort into disrupting what he's calling left-wing terrorist networks, given the fact that more shooters in America are right-wing than left-wing. There's obviously sort of a great deal of hypocrisy to this. But what does this mean in practice to you? It seems like they're desperate to use this as a chance for a major crackdown.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're seeing this as an opportunity for some kind of Viktor Orban style in Hungary crackdown on liberal institutions, whether that's academia, media outlets, nonprofits. And I mean, it's hard to know exactly because they've been so vague. I mean, they haven't, with the exception of George Soros, really explicitly said who they'd go after. And again, like we talked about, there's really no proof that anyone is even tangentially to blame for this besides the suspect himself. And so at the same time, I think it's telling that J.D. Vance went on this big rant about The Nation magazine, writing an article critical of Charlie Kirk's legacy and saying he wasn't, such a great guy in terms of his actions. I mean, that is clearly First Amendment protected speech. It's not an incitement to violence. And yet, we've seen the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, say, hate speech, presumably hate speech, saying you hate conservatives or that conservatives are Nazis, is not protected by the First Amendment. I think it's a scary time, to be frank, for people who love American democracy and our freedom of speech.
I mean, I suppose, the line they want to take is that this is because the left wing are completely out of control and they've been demonizing us. And I think anyone who's listened to any Trump speech ever will find the idea that he's against incendiary language sort of frankly ridiculous. I suppose a more reasonable analysis, I think, is this is a combination of sort of internet-based polarization and guns being everywhere. This was a guy who had guns from a very young age. I mean, are either of those conversations happening, or is America, I suppose, just too polarized for this to be anything other than about the left versus the right?
I think it is primarily going to be about the left versus the right. And as you said, I think it can be challenging in the case of these shooters to sort of filter their ideology, such as it is. It's probably not even really fair to call it ideology. It's sort of this internet nihilism blended with seemingly a little bit of kind of like LGBT, his concern about LGBT rights and what Charlie Kirk was saying. So there's a little bit of, I think, what we might understand as conventional politics, but a lot of it is just, I think, very like Gen Z, internet drenched, approach to the world. And certainly, I mean, the gun control conversation is basically nowhere here. Part of that is because the rifle that was allegedly used is not really one that even Democrats would want to ban. It's, I believe, a bolt action rifle. It's not an AR-15 like we've seen used in so many mass shootings. That's typically become the focal point of criticism. I realize that the UK, this can kind of seem crazy that this kind of gun would, even I think, in gun control discussions, would still be legal.
We'd also ban that gun. But I mean, maybe this is just a very British thing to say as well, but it looked to me like, initially people were saying that looked like a really good shot, presumably with a high sort of quality gun, and that made it seem like it was professional or whatever. But Americans seem to just say, oh no, that was quite an easy shot, and you can kind of do that with any gun.
That's been striking to me as well. And I think that speaks to, particularly, I mean, this is Utah. This is a very conservative area, a lot of guns, a lot of outdoor hunting. I'm not a gun expert myself. And so it struck me as, wow, that must be an impressive shot. And I think you've seen a lot of, or a difficult shot. And I think you've seen a lot of, people who are not familiar with guns like myself feel that way. At the same time, we can see that Tyler Robinson grew up in a culture with a lot of guns. There are a lot of pictures of him with guns. This is a conservative family that I think we can assume had a lot of guns, or at least some amount, and went out hunting perhaps. And so it seems like for people who are relatively familiar with rifles, that this was not that difficult of a shot to make.
That was Will Sommer from The Bulwark speaking to me earlier today. Mike, I wanted to bring you in on this because there was something I didn't cover with Will, which I suppose is, whatever happened here, the fact that the suspect had a partner or roommate who it appears, or it's being reported by the authorities, is trans, means that there are a lot of, I suppose, right-wingers on Twitter who are saying this confirms all of our beliefs that trans people are mentally ill, dangerous people. And I think if you're a trans person right now, it's probably quite scary. So I mean, we see this also, don't we, when there's a terrorist attack by an Islamist, for example. But yeah, just your thoughts on kind of the febrile atmosphere this is creating.
Yeah, I think it's creating a febrile atmosphere in the US. And I think we know the US is already a hugely polarized place politically. Like the left and the right are so polarized in terms of, I think, one of the problems you have in the US is that both the left and the right see each other as an innate threat to the very future of the US as democracy, or the very future of the US as a state moving forward. And I think the right have essentially just used this, the kind of extreme right have used this, and not just the right in general have used this as a chance to crush the liberals. Like, we knew they did this. These liberals, they're completely unhinged, they're a big threat to American stability. So I do, unfortunately what's going to happen is we're going to see marginalized communities, like trans people, be victimized by some of this rhetoric and be targeted by the right without any evidence to suggest that they've done anything wrong. It's just ridiculous. And I think there's so much conspiratorial kind of thinking, as you've highlighted in that interview just now, floating about that people are just latching onto and using it to kind of confirm their biases, right? So if you have a bias against liberals or people on the left or trans people or people of color, wherever it might be, you're able to use this moment to enact those or kind of advance those really regressive views you have on those particular groups of people. And I think, the kind of one of the big legacies, unfortunately, of this murder is going to be that it's going to be increased polarization, increased marginalization of kind of marginalized groups in the US. We already saw, literally on the day of the murder, without knowing anything about who the shooter was or potentially could have been, like we literally knew nothing. There were already people on the right attacking people on the left, literally saying, it's your fault. You guys have done this, and already trying to attach the person to an organization. So, like, people doing that without evidence, that is evidence to suggest that obviously this person had potentially a relationship with someone who's trans. Of course, we're going to see the ramp up. So I think the US is one of those places where the atmosphere is just so febrile. Like, I was speaking to some friends, I have some friends in the US, and it's just one of those where it's just like, my friend was telling me, things are just so tense. Like, discussing politics in person is very, very tense. You don't know if you're going to upset someone, if it was something you say. You don't know who's in the room and what could be the consequence of what you say, in terms of if you make a remark that kind of condemns Charlie Kirk's politics in the office, does that mean you're going to be seen as celebrating his murder or his death? Things just seem so febrile in a way. It just feels totally bizarre and totally kind of against the way a democracy should operate. So, yeah, I do worry for kind of trans people and marginalized groups on the left and more broadly in the US, because I think people on the right are going to use this as a moment to push and advance regressive positions and policies that are going to have real harmful effects.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I should say, I mean, yeah, I know you're saying people on the right want to blame this on anyone they don't like. I have seen that on the left as well. I think the whole idea that this was a groyper with all the evidence we have now, unless there is some wild conspiracy and these messages were just a total fraud, it does seem like the politics are more left than they are right, and it would Charlie Kirk is one of the most prominent right wing sort of talkers in the world, actually. Thank you, Mike, for joining us this evening. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, good to be back. A pleasure being with the Novara family. I love it.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.